Once again, I'm Larry Weber, and it gives me a great pleasure and great honor to be moderating this last session of the symposium this afternoon, 5 years out, ongoing impacts and challenges of the 2008 flood. And as we were involved in the organization of the symposium and working to try to build the day's event to this final session, as a planning committee, we started thinking about who potential speakers could be, and we had a nice list of folks, and we're just absolutely delighted that everybody that we extended an invitation to was able to join us. So we really have our dream team of folks up here in this last session, and I will give just a little bit of a shout out to Chuck Gipp. He thought that he had a conflict today and wouldn't be able to join us. We would have Chuck here as well. He was able to stop in for a few minutes to join this session as an audience member, but we're not going to embarrass him and bring him up to the stage unpreparedly to participate. But thank you, Chuck. We really do appreciate you joining us this afternoon. So with that said, I'd like to just do very brief introductions of the panelists. We have this illustrious group here. We cover all areas of watershed policy and planning here. To my immediate left is State Senator Rob Hogg, who has been mentioned several times today about his tireless work towards flood policy in Iowa. Further to the left is Secretary Bill Northey, who is the Secretary of Agriculture, also the chair of the Water Resources Coordinating Council, serves the state in many capacities, both in ag-related and water-related interest and issues in Iowa, and we're delighted to have Secretary Northey with us. Ralph Rosenberg, Executive Director of the Iowa Environmental Council, again, former state legislator, active in Iowa water policy issues. Delighted to have Ralph with us. Jim Schwab, who helped us 5 years ago in the initial Forkenbrock Symposium as a speaker. He is a public planner and comes to us with a little bit of an arm's length view of Iowa, and so we're delighted to have Jim with us this afternoon. And Roger Wolf at the far end of the table, all kind of packed here on the stage. Roger, of course, from the Iowa Soybean Association, and Roger represents one of the commodity producers in Iowa who's taken a very strong interest in environmental and water issues and bringing that balance to water, natural, and agricultural resources. So we have a great panel here. We're going to try to limit each of the panelists to about 5 minutes. This is a slide-free zone. I know, with a couple of elected folks here, we're going to make sure that this isn't the kickoff to the next campaign, Senator Hogg. And so, to my immediate left, I'm going to keep my hand on his shoulder, and I'm going to squeeze with increasing pressure as we move on. We're going to put the clock on. But we did decide for this, we really want this to be a conversation, and so we have conversationalists here. These folks have much to share, and we did want to do it more as a conversation than another slide presentation. So with that, Senator Hogg, if you'd kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Larry, and thanks everybody for being here. Welcome to Senate District 33. It's great to have you here. I want to start really quick and just remind us why we're here, and it's because we want to avoid the heartache and the trauma and the damage and the economic loss that goes with floods. And we've seen a lot of them in Iowa over the last few years. 08 was just one, but as I've had to try to remind people in Cedar Rapids, it wasn't just Cedar Rapids, it was all over Iowa in 08. And then in 10, we had dramatic flooding from Cherokee to Colfax, Ames to Ottumwa, the 4 Mile Creek neighborhood in Des Moines, to Lake Delhi. In 11, it was all of western Iowa. Dubuque, people have forgotten about the massive flooding in Dubuque when they got 12 or 13 inches of rain, and other parts of northeast Iowa. And now again, here we are in 13, looking at significant flooding. And I will just say, having seen what's going on in the upper Iowa River Basin, I think Iowa City is in deep, deep trouble. I was over there on Wednesday, and it was already almost up to where it was in 08 in Marshall County and Tama County, and they were getting a lot more rain then, so we've got to watch out for that. We know that flooding's always happened. Somebody gave me a great book by Barry on the 1927 Mississippi River flood, and so we need to prepare for flooding, and as we've heard from some speakers today, climate change makes that even more urgent. Let me just quickly, like the mayor did this morning, plug my book. America's Climate Century. And I would just say none of us asked for this problem, but it is now the story of this century that we're going to have to deal with climate change. And today only, it's available at the Czech and Slovak Museum. I donated books, and you can get it there for $10.95 in the gift shop. They make great presents for high school graduates, college graduates. Anyhow, next point I want to make. If we want to say never again to the level of damage that we sustained in 2008 and other times, we've actually got to implement stuff and do stuff and change the way we're doing things. And in Cedar Rapids, that's both the comprehensive flood protection plan and upstream watershed management, and we have to do it. I'd much rather spend $1 billion or $2 billion on that than ever sustain the $5 billion in economic losses that we sustain and the heartache and the trauma that goes with it. I have distributed a sheet, or asked to have distributed a sheet, which is my draft Cedar River Basin Watershed Management proposal on a page that talks about putting in detention basins throughout the watershed, restoring wetlands, doing vegetated buffers, and I would add, after seeing this morning's presentation by Rick Cruz, better agricultural cover crops, and Cam Yar's presentation, and Dick Sloan, and we can do this. I would mention it has a lot of complementary benefits, one of which is clean water. And as John Lawrence from Iowa State Extension explained to the legislature this year, just to meet our clean water goals, we're looking at an investment in the billions. And so we might as well make the investment and deal with floodwaters and clean water at the same time and get it done. And if we can do it over 5 or 10 years, let's do it. Let's get after it. By the way, my plan I know is not perfect. I count on people like Larry to fix it up and actually make it work and stuff like that. But I do think it's in the ballpark. I do think it's in the ballpark, and we need to change the dynamic. Third thing I want to just really say, there's been a couple mentions to the Cedar River Watershed Coalition, which is a group I started with Cam Yar in early 2010. Our coordinator, Mary Beth Stevenson, is on maternity leave. That's good news. She's had her second child, so that's really exciting. Our next meeting will be on September 20th at the Cedar Rapids Public Library, so if you'd like to join us there, that would be great. Now, finally, can we do this or not? Of course we can. Our speaker, our keynote speaker, watch this, I'm going to check my card, Susan. Is that right? From South Carolina. Go Gamecocks. Susan Cutter. Susan has a picture in the brochure she passes out of the people standing in the water on the sandbag brigade at Mercy Hospital, which it doesn't say there. That was at midnight on the night of June 12th, 2008. And here's the point. People want to be engaged and they want to help. It's the spirit of the sandbag. We just need that same spirit now before the next disaster. Well, hopefully we're not too late on this one. But we need to get after it. And we can do that if we get after it. We've got to safeguard our people and our property. It requires policy at all levels, local, state, national, focused, and make sure we have the choice and the capacity to say never again to that, and that's what I hope we will do. Thank you.
Secretary Northey.
Great. Well, again, as well, thank you, everybody, for being here and being a part of the discussion. Look forward to the comments and questions. So I'm going to try and hit 3 things real quick. One is just the relationships that need to be built across different organizations. Larry mentioned the Water Resources Coordinating Council. Several years ago, the legislature put an organization together called the Water Resources Coordinating Council that was a group of the state agencies and federal agencies that have some impact around water, different pieces of it. Some of us very, very engaged, others less so engaged. That group has been meeting now fairly actively the last couple of years and is aggressively looking at both water quality issues but flooding issues as well. Plenty more to do. We continue, every time we meet, find out that somebody is doing something that we had no idea another agency was doing. And so we have all these pieces where the coordination needs to happen. Now, you know, to everybody outside of government should understand what other parts of government's doing. It's probably no surprise to anybody in this room that doesn't always happen. And this is a piece that is helpful to us on some of that implementation, and to make sure that we're not doing something one place that messes up something that somebody else is doing. Now, in addition to that, there's another organization called WPAC that is a group of the NGOs, the environmental organizations and ag organizations, and they meet as well. We often meet together, and as we're talking about the different pieces that we're all working on, we're sharing between the government agencies, the federal and state organizations, and the private organizations that are doing things. I'm sure Roger will talk about what Iowa Soybean's doing. And to be able to talk about how we can be helpful to each other, how we understand what's happening, where are resources, where can we cooperate and partner, what kinds of things are coming. Number two, the legislature this year, and certainly with some leadership by Senator Hogg and many others, it helped in a water quality effort that will have flood impacts as well. And so what we have is a nutrient reduction strategy, a strategy to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus coming from our farm fields. Now, this strategy also has pieces, the strategy itself has pieces looking at point sources. But the focus of the dollars there to put practices on the ground was non-point, so we're talking farmland. $2.4 million for this next fiscal year. The Senate leadership, the Democratic leadership, initiated $10 million worth of one-time money that can be spent over the next 5 years as well as part of that. Besides some additional cost share projects that can be done out there, we have normally a conservation cost share where we do a lot of conservation practices, terraces, water retention basins, other things that can have an impact on water quantity. That normally is $6.7 million. Out of conference, that comes back as $7 million worth of one-time money in addition to that 6.7, and that can be spent over the next 5 years. So several pieces there that I think will be very helpful to all of us working together. One of the first things that we have to do is in the next few weeks, hopefully we'll get a governor's signature very soon, and to be able to formally get our coordinator on staff. When we talk about a project coordinator, that's really what they're to do, is work with things in our department and the folks that are there, but to coordinate with everybody else who's doing things and make sure that when Ag Clean Water Alliance is doing things on the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River, that we're coordinating the things that we're doing in the department as well. When Iowa Soybean is doing things that we're sharing field days, we're sharing communication. It's a heavy lift to impact 90,000 producers' decisions across the state, and it's going to take all of us doing it. Let me close with one last example. And so cover crops, I think, had been talked about earlier today. We believe that's going to be one of the signal efforts that we put in. We believe certainly would have been very helpful in some of our fields this year with the rains that we have out there. We had cover crops on them. We think it's good agronomic practice as well. We ran into a piece this spring where crop insurance had some rules of when cover crops had to be killed. And so we end up with places where we don't even think that we have to coordinate or sometimes fight regulations. In this case, we got some grazing extended on those cover crops. That's a good use and allowed those cover crops to be on the ground a little bit longer. But it took getting the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation to agree to that and then getting the crop insurance companies to agree to that. Those are pieces we'll work out one at a time, but no doubt everything else that we're working on is going to have some of those same kind of struggles to go through. That's why we all need to figure out what those are, what are limiting our ability to do the implementation the Senator talked about. We've got to implement, got pieces that can happen. It's always going to be a little tougher than we think, but it has to happen. It has to happen.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Northey. Ralph, I'll mention that the first two speakers within a second finished in 5 minutes.
Oh.
See, that's training.
Your watch?
Yeah.
You started a little bit after they began, though. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Flood Center. I think it really should be applauded for doing this. And I want to just mention four or 5 points about moving forward and how we can move forward. One is I'd like to just overall see us move forward the same sort of spirit we have today, The same kind of spirit we see in Cedar Rapids, I want to see applied towards developing better policies and implementations of policies. I don't live in this area, but you certainly see it, and someone mentioned the picture of the people wading in knee-deep water. The same teamwork that's been talked about several times already today that you see, I saw last night with sandbagging in Cedar Rapids. The same sort of teamwork we need, and we do see somewhat in terms of natural disasters, and I want to see that moving forward. I know the Flood Center, now I know that Flood Center has already given this presentation to other groups, and I think moving forward, I would certainly hope that people in this audience who have groups that would expand the exposure of groups, many different groups, for presentations. I'm not asking for an invitation for myself, but I'm thinking for other people that presented today, I think it was very valuable to have this kind of a dialogue. Moving forward, we need to duplicate and go to scale what Rob was talking about. We need to duplicate and go to scale the Cedar River Basin Watershed Management Proposal. We already have some good sub-watershed efforts, but we need to duplicate this and go to scale. We need to do this. And also, while doing this, we can't retreat, because sometimes I notice we take 2 steps forward and sometimes go 2 steps backwards in some environmental or natural resource concerns. So I want to see this going forward. Moving forward, someone talked about, or not someone, the agenda talked about closing the gap between urban and rural. I mean, I think there's also gaps within urban and in rural. So I think we should build upon existing voluntary efforts. I don't believe we can only rely upon voluntary efforts. I agree that some of the voluntary efforts Secretary Northey talked about are good starts, but I also believe, I represent a coalition of environmental and natural resources groups that voluntary alone won't work. And you heard other speakers talk about things beyond voluntary. And just on a personal, I'm going to back up on flood. I've personally lived through flooding. I mean, my house has been flooded. It was flooded in Ames when I was a legislator, and so on a personal and professional level, I am very sympathetic to people. I've seen what's going on, but I've also seen a couple things. And moving forward, we statewide, not like Cedar Rapids, but statewide, I've seen other evidence of us ignoring science. I saw it when I served in one of the first legislative interim committees in 1993, where several people spoke about this before, where the science is there on both climate change or flooding and prevent flooding. Moving forward, we need to have the partnerships. I think it was either Jeff Pomerantz or your mayor talked about the partnerships and the money. Moving forward, we need to have policies which in the agriculture area, which encourage moving people and structure out of harm's way, allowing wetlands and floodplains to slow and absorb excess water during floods. We need to encourage those, but voluntary may not be enough. Moving forward, we need to do certain more things we can control. We can control things dealing with climate change, as Rob's books and other legislators have talked about too. We know we can do it. We have legislators to here like Joe who are pushing forward for renewable energy policies, which not only make Iowa a little more independent, less dependent upon imported fuels, but also producing less greenhouse effect, less climate change, and overall having ourselves contribute to preventing flooding. There is a photo that Susan had of an American flag planted in Moore, Oklahoma. And several of you talked about what's patriotic. And it's interesting, we see flags during disasters and horrible disasters, the tornadoes and hurricanes. But someone also, we need to make it patriotic too for the kind of roll up your sleeves policies, the long-term policies, like it's patriotic to have a Cedar Rapids Basin Watershed Management Proposal. We need to have American flags planted with proposals like this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ralph. Jim?
Okay. Larry said that I was the person who had a little bit of an arm's length view. It doesn't extend any further than Chicago, and it doesn't extend any further than being a Hawkeye alumnus in the first place and still teaching with the planning school at the university. And I operate in the capacity of managing something called the Hazards Planning Research Center at the American Planning Association. So I work with city planners. In that capacity, a little over a week ago, I was talking about climate change in the water wonderland of Venice, and then on the way home had to struggle with the question of what would I say when I got to Cedar Rapids. And it wasn't easy looking at the topic here, but I hit on something because I wanted to get beneath the question of just particular policies to what are some of the underlying problems that we have to face in making our policies effective in the first place and getting them implemented. And so I'm going to start by telling you that I think I've learned that disasters come at all scales, from the personal to the global. And how did I learn that? Well, part of it is that my wife and I happen to be, well, we're kind of out of this stage now, but we spent a lot of years as foster and adoptive parents. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, because you accept the consequences in that role of taking over a job where someone else did a miserable job of parenting. And the result of that is something that ripples through those children's lives for a long time, with the effect that over those years dealt with all sorts of issues like, self-pity, resentment, unwillingness to connect cause and effect, connect actions and consequences, the clinging to the world as we want it to be instead of beginning to embrace an understanding of the world as it really operates. And the reason I mention this is because one of the things that I've learned as a planner, and believe me, I've had even some of the counselors we worked with for our girls mentioned, boy, there's a connection between your work on planning for disasters and doing this stuff, I mention it because, we need a gut level understanding, many of us, and particularly for planners, of what it is that causes people, particularly who've been through trauma of any kind, to become less rational human beings and much more emotional in their reaction to various kinds of events and the way in which they think about things. Because if we don't understand that, then we don't learn how to overcome some of those obstacles to making public policy more effective and dealing with real problems. And the cause and effect are not always very simple. Actions and consequences are not always easy to connect. There are cross currents of all kinds of conflicting events in life that make it difficult to sort out some of those issues. And frankly, I think that's where we need the help of the kind of math and science and technical understandings that Kamyar Anchayan was talking about earlier today, in order to help inform ourselves of what exactly are those causes and effects and how we connect what we're doing with the results we get. And that gets me to what planners spend their days doing, because a good part of the planner's job in a community is basically advisory to elected officials to make clear the consequences of public policy choices, connecting what we choose to do in the public arena with some outcomes, helping to foster a more informed public and business and institutional community that understands the results of the choices that we make. And I think one of the problems we have today, and I can speak from long experience on this, is that our overly ideological politics today tends to obscure and obliterate sometimes an understanding of those causes and effects of what the consequences are of some of the choices we make. And a clear example of that is no matter how much evidence we put out in front of people on global warming, we still have people who want to ignore and reject every bit of it and see some sort of conspiracy behind the whole idea of even presenting that evidence in the first place. Now, I mention this because disasters by nature, and everybody I've met in the community development department here in Cedar Rapids can confirm this, disasters are generally emotional events, and people do need a chance to vent. They do need a chance to go through all those emotional experiences that come out of the trauma of having experienced a major flood like that make it that much more difficult for them to, kind of connect cause and effect dispassionately. And so we get the denial, something that we all know is happening but we don't want to really believe that it's happening. Or sometimes the displacement, we heard some talk about, well, if it weren't for those people upstream causing all these problems that we have down here. Well, yeah, that's, you can always make it somebody else's fault, but what I want to suggest on that upstream downstream problem is that part of the problem there is the question of just how big is the prism through which we're looking at the problem. If the prism is only as big as our municipality, then we do have a problem with that displacement of blame to get to the root of the problem. But if we broaden the field and say this is a watershed problem, we can all work on this cooperatively, then the nature of the problem changes. It's a matter of reflecting the scope of the problem. I won't go into that in more detail because I'll run out of my 5 minutes, but I do want to say, there was an example recently, within the last couple of years, and I won't name the county, I won't name the official, I don't remember who it was anyway, where they said, they had a disaster, they didn't sign up the county for the National Flood Insurance Program because, and I quote this from the media article, there were strings attached. This is an example of the problem that I'm talking about in terms of connecting actions and consequences, because it seems like there wasn't a lot of thought here in terms of the question of understanding the nature of business and the free market. And this probably came from somebody who believes in the free market, because, I don't know about the rest of you. I have health insurance, life insurance, car insurance, all kinds of insurance, and I can't think of a single policy I've got that hasn't got strings attached. Because it's in the nature of insurance companies, insurers, whether it's the National Flood Insurance Program and a federal program or the private market, to want to reduce losses somehow. You can debate whether or not the NFIP does the best possible job of reducing losses, but the whole point of the strings that are attached is to try to reduce the losses that we suffer from flooding. Duh.
Hey, Jim,
So, yeah.
since you've used the 1 minute that Ralph handed to you, plus your 5, I'll ask you to wrap up in a minute.
Okay.
Keep moving.
So let me just begin to wrap up in a couple of Number one, I think part of our problem also is needing to better educate people through improvements in NFIP terminology. Thank you, Julie. Yes, I can't think of a terminology that I have begun to dislike more than the 100-year flood, because it doesn't tell people what they really need to know. We need to explain what the realities are. As I often explain to my students, have you ever seen water that got to the 100-year flood line on the map and said, I'm not allowed to go any further because the regulations don't let me go there? People who argue about whether or not they're required to have flood insurance because the map was changed, guess what? You were in the floodplain to begin with, you just didn't know it because we hadn't properly educated you before. So bottom line, I'll finish right here, is you don't want your community to be faced with the famous question from Dr. Phil, how's that working out for you? What you want is to be more like Cedar Rapids. I will say, my last point, we are actually using Cedar Rapids as a great case study in a new report that I hope you will all look for in about a year, that we're doing with FEMA grants on planning for post-disaster recovery, next generation, because it's a rewrite of a previous document some of you may have seen from 1998. And we've been working on that for the last 2.5 years. And
Great. Thank you, Jim. Okay, Roger gets to bat last.
Okay, I'm gonna turn my phone on just to make sure I get my 5 minutes.
See, right away, we got to get all chippy.
If he gets it, yeah.
So I'm here today representing the Iowa Soybean Association, and I'm proud to be here. And thank you for asking me to be here. It's a great pleasure. And I just wanted to say, I remember coming to Cedar Rapids and going to Armstrong's with my grandmother, and I remember a vibrant downtown. I grew up on the Buffalo Creek over in Jones and Lynn County, so I've seen these Eastern Iowa events, and I've walked through many floodwaters trying to get to school, the school bus. So I have a personal connection with it. I've worked in soil and water conservation issues for 25 years. I've worked as an environmental specialist on small watershed projects beginning in the 1990s. I've been self-employed and now at the Iowa Soybean Association. This is a position that the board of 21 farmers that I work at their pleasure have created. And we manage the soybean checkoff. And so if you grow soybeans in frankly, anywhere in this country, a portion of the market value of those soybeans goes into a pot of money. And these farmers annually invest some of those funds on behalf of agriculture and trying to improve productivity and profitability, but also with some concern for conservation and the environment. And so today, I've been at Iowa Soybean Association 13 years. I have 8 staff. We're working in 52 defined watersheds across the state of Iowa. That's at multiple scales. Some of that in central Iowa is at the what's called the 8-digit hydrologic unit scale size. That'd be like the Raccoon River or the Des Moines River. And then about 44 different Huck 12s. That's a 20,000 acre scale watershed. And we're all about trying to scale that up, because what happens at the local scale, and you get your arms around a Huck 12 scale watershed, okay? And so much of this, and I was pleased to hear the presentations earlier about resiliency. This is about improving our capacity and capabilities. I view all this stuff as maturity. And I was pleased to go after you. I mean, you were talking about raising kids, and boy, I got 4 kids, and I've been through trials and tribulations. This is about maturity. We want our kids to grow up, right? And we want our state to perform. We know we want quality water. I have yet to meet a farmer that doesn't want the water to be good quality, and that's the truth. Now, so a key strategy for our work is that we integrate planning and we advance these strategies. We wear the farmer's hat, okay? We go into these watersheds. It's a little bit unique. We're not from the government. We wear a farmer's hat, and we try to bring data and information into the picture. Where are we starting from? Where do we want to go? As the previous panelists just talked about, we're trying to bring data and information so that they can make informed decisions, so that they can make informed decisions, not somebody else deciding for them. And this is about building a culture of resiliency. And that's really the path that we're on. And frankly, I think this 5 years, we're celebrating a more resilient system. We're maturing. In 2012, we began investing with a bunch of partners in the Upper Cedar watershed, and I know some of those folks are here. We're working with them on long-term watershed plan development, nutrient management planning with area farmers, soil and nutrient loss risk assessment, hydrology assessments with the Flood Center, and that's what I'm really excited about, because this I call it the crosstalk between hydrology and water quality. I think we can make tremendous progress when we think about addressing hydrology, and I think we'll see that as we begin to implement the nutrient reduction strategy. And I agree with Secretary Northey. Cover crops is a game changer, folks. And Iowa farmers planted 100,000 acres of cover crops. We raised 23 million acres of row crop agriculture. We're going to see millions of acres of cover crops in the next, I don't know, can I dare to say the next 5 to 10 years, millions of acres. And there's going to be improvements for farming and for agriculture. So a few recommendations on policy. We need to continue to foster integrated watershed management approaches at all levels. We're an advocate for that approach. We need to advance site-specific initiatives using locally collected data to guide implementation. You got to have, this data is important to be able to talk about progress. It's important for making decisions and setting strategy and guiding investment. We need to create and support research and monitoring means incorporating outcome data as feedback for adjusting implementation strategies and tactics as we go. This is about adaptive management. It's about performance. And we need to advance intergovernmental cooperation, and public-private partnerships have to be aligned with that. And I hope that you recognize that the Soybean Association is attempting to align with the local, state, and federal government agencies. This is a partnership effort. If we don't do this, then shame on us. This alignment is extremely important. I have a variety of other things, but I'm probably out of my 5 minutes, aren't I?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I'm sure you'll get a chance to weave those into comments as we respond to the audience's questions. Thanks. Okay, we have a wonderful opportunity here. We have about an hour left in the program. We wanted to leave plenty of time. That's why we held the speakers to 5 minutes. We'd like to open it up to questions. I think we've heard throughout the day, and again from the panelists, that we have the means, we have the information, the science in many ways. We have the ability to move things forward. We have 5 leaders in our state here. How do we get going? How do we move forward? And so I'd like to open it up to questions and get started there. Pete, did you have a question?
I'm going to start with an easy one.
Yes.
On behalf of the Public Policy Center, first, I want to thank you all both for coming, but also for the civil discourse that, across the table and throughout the entire day, and that's what Public Policy Center will be trying to do, bring people together. The Flood Center is trying to do that. But if we also don't have a real conversation, we can't move things forward. And so if you think about where we go from here, and who do we need to engage in that conversation, and how can we do it in a way that's a positive, not threatening to folks who don't necessarily want data-driven approaches or, have the same feeling about the urgency of some of these issues. And how can we do that so that we can actually make progress toward the issues that I think everybody in this industry needs to work with?
Great. Thanks, Pete. Rob, you want to
Yeah, I will start with that, and thank you for the question. Look, politics is about 2 things, and I'm not saying politics like where I sit up here and put up a swarmy picture of Secretary Northey or something like that. I'm talking politics in its good sense. It's about 2 things. Number one, it's about the art of the possible, right? People have heard that phrase, politics is the art of the possible. The other thing it's about is making things possible that previously weren't possible. Okay, and so where we are today is Secretary Northey did a great job, and it was, as always, it was great to work with him this year on these initiatives. We started out, Secretary Northey had the proposal for the nutrient reduction strategy, $6.8 million over 2 years. Might sound like a lot of money, but it's less than about 50 cents per acre of farmland in the state, of corn, 50 cents per acre of corn in the state. So that was a start. Senate Democrats said, we've got this large cash surplus right now as a state. We ought to invest some of that. I kind of had on the order of magnitude in mind $200 million. Senator Gronstall gave me $20 million, okay, and gave us sort of that he thought that was doable, and we did that. And we came up with $20 million for the water quality initiative, for going through the backlog on voluntary soil conservation cost share stuff where there's a backlog because we haven't been investing enough resources. And then third, continuation of the Watershed Improvement Review Board. So that was good. The other thing we worked on that I thought was really important on the water quality side was the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, a partnership of our universities, led by our universities, including private colleges, others, to bring the best science to bear on how we meet our clean water goals. So you see where I'm getting at? We got down to something that was doable. Politics is the art of the possible. It required some give and take. It wasn't written exactly the way I would have wanted it written, but we got it done. Okay, here's what we now need to do going forward is to work on creating something, creating the possibility of something much larger. That's the challenge. That's why I've come back now, something I did a couple years ago, didn't fly. Now we're going to come back at it with a bigger Cedar River watershed management plan. If you actually want comprehensive watershed management, how many of you would be willing to pool our resources and spend $1 billion if you knew you were going to be able to avoid $3 billion of damage in the next time it floods? I'd do it in a heartbeat, because that's not money down a rat hole. That's money that's invested in rural economic development and things around our state to improve quality of life, improve water, reduce flood risk, improve recreation, improve habitat. We can do this, but we got to make it possible. And so that's the challenge now. And, you know, we've had some upstream, downstream debate. Here's the deal. Downstream, we don't want flood damage, and we'd like clean water. Upstream, you need financial assistance. There's a deal. Cities have political clout, resources. Farmers have political clout, need assistance to do the right thing. Well, let's do it. Let's just do that. As Dennis Gumate told me, we're all in this watershed together. So let's just do it. And that's what needs to happen now. So everybody's got a job. You're a local governmental official, you got a job. You're a concerned citizen, you got a job. You're involved in an interest group, you got a job. You got to ask people and expect people that we're going to come together around a comprehensive strategy with resources and a plan to implement it, so we can avoid or reduce future flood damage. That's what we need.
Thank you, Rob. Anybody else? I think Ralph was wanting to comment.
I think the whole issues of climate change and flood control has to be elevated to a level of urgency. I don't think we should settle without it saying it's urgent. You just look at the last legislative year, whether you agree with these proposals, doesn't matter. Governor Branstad said it was urgent to have some tax relief. It was urgent to deal with Medicaid and health care. It was urgent to have education reform, and those passed. Now, I know everyone has different views, but there was an urgency, and the Democrats in the legislature also had their version of what these urgent needs would look like. But both parties really felt those were issues that were urgent. I don't see this urgency statewide. I see Mark Kuhn in this room, and Mark's feeling an urgency. He helped establish a watershed program in northern Iowa. I don't see this urgency statewide. Instead, what I learned here today is I learned that in Washington County, a bunch of supervisors said, we think we need to have some sort of land use policies, and the ones who voted yes were thrown out of office. So the kind of urgency I want to see is people get reelected who say, you know what, our county should have some sort of land use planning, not get thrown out of office. So that's the kind of urgency I want to see. And that we as constituents, reinforce the people who are willing to take some leadership on this. So that's what I really feel that, and without that urgency, we'll be back we need to have that urgency. I've seen too many floods, and actually Cedar Rapids has proven you've given some meaning to the word urgency and how you responded. The urgency is going to be with the other several hundred cities and the other 98 counties.
With total agreement about the question of urgency, I also want to step back just a little bit to talk about the longer view of changing the public perception, the public opinion that helps drive public policy in the first place. One of the things that I think Cedar Rapids did most successfully was widespread public participation in the planning process that ultimately drove the success of much of what they did here. Involving the public in these discussions, engaging people in a way that causes them to come to grips with those causes and consequences that I was talking about earlier, is not always an easy task. But it is certainly one that I know that planners are well trained for, or should be. they should know how to begin to pull people into a process of some kind of civil discourse, as Peter was mentioning, and begin to tackle these issues, but also at the same time help drive some sense of informed discussion, not just, throwing issues out on the table and discussing them in the abstract without a real fact base behind them, but really understanding, here's what we know will happen if we do X. Now, there are a lot of resources out there, including one from the National Institute of Building Sciences. It was done a congressional study, 2004, I believe it was. Mitigation pays. And what it did was basically look at the economics of hazard mitigation. Found on average that $1 of federal money invested in hazard mitigation produced about $4 in benefits in reduced flood losses or reduced disaster losses overall. It varied from one type of disaster to another. With flood, actually, the number was 9 to 1. $1 of federal money invested in flood mitigation resulting in $9 of long-term loss reduction. When we put that out on the table and start looking at, what we're doing with our public monies, I think if we can get people engaged in that kind of discussion, we can get a lot of balls moving in the right direction. We may have to face some institutional obstacles, but we can get into that discussion.
Right. Thanks, Jim. Secretary Northey, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, the question about who's next and what other things need to happen, certainly I think we're at the stage where we're going to see a lot of participation by farmers as we get this out in the ground. And I'm going to argue that there's been a lot of groundwork to get us to this point. The stuff that Iowa Soybean has done that's beyond what most organizations have engaged in has been very important to laying the groundwork, making this a very important thing for farmers to engage in. Other groups and ag organizations in the state as well are committed to this, and I believe we're ready politically as well as having the resources and the authority to be able to go forward and really make some things happen. Now, I think the other things that have the potential of being creative in having that happen is putting groups and people together that weren't working together before in some of these projects. We expect to have 5 Huck 12 watersheds that are our pilot watersheds, and we very aggressively go after high concentration of practices within those Huck 12s. We expect all 5 of those likely to be led by different sorts of organizations or a combination of organizations doing different things, trying to show us what's best to be able to engage folks. And I think as we engage lots of folks with new partnerships, I think this has a way of feeding on itself. I want to add an emphasis as well to the research part. And Larry was a part of drawing up a plan here. We had a conversation about, well, we know there's things that we need to do, that we know that there's a lot of things we don't know yet about the hydrology of how does soil release its organic matter, and when does that nitrogen get to a tile line, and how does it happen versus other times. We know generalities, but we don't know specifics that could be very, very helpful in remanaging things that we're doing out there. And so this center offers us an opportunity to be able to understand that better, understand how practices need to be done in a way that's more effective, and understand what's happening at a larger scale level. So we understand what the levels are and how it varies from before a storm to after a storm, and a drought year to a flood year. And so those pieces are really important. We finish with saying, I think although we're talking about a water quality initiative that is in the 20s of millions of dollars, by the time you take the $20 million at one time, 6.8 over the next 2 years, 1.5 for the research center, it compared to some of the other big efforts, that's a small piece. But understand there is nobody else around the country that is doing what this legislature just did. This is unique. Now, that means that we all got a lot of work to do to make sure that it shows fruit, and we can show there was a good investment, and that if there's more dollars in the future, can follow good work that's being done. but frankly, there's been nothing like this around water quality. We do different parts of soil conservation, lots of good stuff on soil conservation, but really nitrogen and phosphorus around water quality, this is unique. So I think that they are to be congratulated. I think everybody who was a part of making that happen is, and now we all have a lot of work to make sure that we get the fruit out of that. But this is a unique time, not near where it needs to be over the long term. Frankly, we probably weren't ready for $200 million right now, but we will be at some point. But we're certainly ready to be able to make good use out of the dollars that are there.
Well, and I think it's real important that we have the leadership in place in the state. And unfortunately, you weren't able to join us this morning, but that was a good theme within the discussions that we've had too, is leadership in the state agencies, leadership in the governor's office, leadership in the legislature. And you've spoken to that now, and I appreciate that. I'd like to move on. I have a question here from the audience, and in fact, I have 3 questions from 3 separate individuals, and they all sort of wrap together. And so, with my apologies to each of the 3 folks, I'm going to try to wrap them together. But it really does relate to this balance between agricultural, natural, water, and economic resources. And given the commodity prices being so favorable today, and the conservation programs always being challenged by having enough resources for conservation, how do we bring balance between productivity and conservation given the market forces in play? And so anybody that would like to could respond to that. Roger, since you didn't get a chance on the last round.
Well, one thing I want to say, and I've participated in Farm Bill discussions on the conservation title and the commodity title, and the reality is that there's never going to be enough public resources to do the conservation job. We can't incentivize everybody to do the right thing. The private investment in conservation has to prevail. And the truth of the matter is that we've never accounted for the private investment in conservation. The discussion about resiliency today is how do we value conservation? And we just heard a comment about, we've never done this on water quality, and that's exactly right. Our conservation policy has been focused on the productive capacity of the soil resource, not the water quality impact. So when I hear comments about the voluntary approach, it has failed, well, we've never attempted to coordinate a voluntary approach to perform for water quality. Okay, so I think we have to begin valuing the private investment in conservation. And I think we will find that there's an awful lot, hundreds of millions of dollars of private investment in conservation. Right now, our conservation programs are definitely oversubscribed. We've seen that in the state. We've seen it federally. We're never going to have the kind of resources we need. We have too many competing issues that taxpayers have to pay for. I think. That's my opinion. So it has to be about the culture and the ethic of conservation, and if we value water and we value downstream interests, then it has to be this investment.
Thanks, Roger. Ralph?
Sure. It feels funny here being a member of the dream team, being in the middle. I'm in the center of the dream team. Played basketball all my life. I was never the center. I'm not sure politically either how this fits, but I'll let you theoretically figure this one out. There are a couple things we can do. One, you can certainly let your federal elected officials know about the Farm Bill. Our council strongly supports tying conservation compliance, and some of the other members here may or wish to comment or not. But so there is pending federal legislation that is significant regarding agriculture practices and conservation, which could also impact floods as well. And the second thing, another point is, actually I do agree with the Secretary on several things he said, including soybean associations, one of our favorite ag commodity groups too. So I want to say that, Roger.
Thank you.
That would say that now, and in the same breath, I want to say that is that in addition to whatever the need to document what Roger was talking about, the need to document, quantify the amount of investments farmers have done, we also need to, someone used the word monetize earlier today. What's the benefits of water quality? What are the benefits of preventing the flood? I think you folks in Cedar Rapids know the cost. So what are the benefits of preventing flooding? What's the benefits of having that water, clean water? What are the benefits that Des Moines doesn't have to put in its nitrate removal system? So I'll go along with, Roger says, let's look at how much private farmers put in, and I also want to see what the quantifying the cost of cleaner water is as well.
Secretary Northey?
If I can, real quick, I think we are concerned about the impact and the land use change that come about from high commodity prices, and you see some portion of that. For the most part, Iowa's still farmed the same way it was. There are little pieces, little parts of CRP, little pieces of pasture that didn't used to be that are now farmed, so that definitely has some impact. Not as much probably in some other places that wasn't farmed as intensely before. But I'd say that that's no out for us in hoping that commodity prices go down, because we had water quality issues before commodity prices went up. So that is not going to fix it
Agreed.
just to change it. We have issues that are as much technically driven as they are monetarily driven. And so the pieces, one of the things we've been trying to work with folks, and I think it's those things that'll come about, is getting more tools for producers to use to do a better job. First, that they can measure, that they can care about, that they can keep that nitrogen on their farm, that they can make sure the erosion doesn't happen and they lose that phosphorus, but then be able to apply it later in the season, to be able to test the soil later in the season and not have to apply it early. And there's several different pieces that would have been better, frankly, this year, especially with the drought that we had last year. If we could have applied last year's nitrogen later in the season, we wouldn't have applied near so much, and then we wouldn't have been set up for such a nasty situation with having that flush out of the soil in these heavy rains. So technology helping producers, I believe we have the potential of creating markets for some of that technology. We have companies in Iowa that believe that too. And they believe that there will be farmers out there buying some of these tools that will be better. That would be better for their operation, and that there will be a market for that. And I think to provide folks more tools is one of the things that's going to be very important. Whatever the commodity prices are, there's actually some benefit to high commodity prices because farmers have more money to spend on those tools. We don't need the 80s all over again either, because frankly, farmers wouldn't spend much money at all looking at trying to buy those tools. So we need some kind of happy balance. None of us control those pieces. But I think there's some reason to be optimistic as well.
Great, thank you. I have another question here, and we're talking about water management and policy. I'm not sure this exactly fits, but it seems like kind of a fun question. What do you want to see happen on the national level with Harkin's vacated seat? Secretary Northey? You can choose to respond or not respond.
Yeah, who at this table is planning to run for that seat?
Senator? No.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
The question was posed, and we'll move forward from there. So,
Let me just
Don't give him any ideas.
no. Let me just say, I do think that Iowa, in Iowa political leadership, congressional leadership, whether it's House or Senate, they need to engage on these issues and understand these issues. They need to understand agriculture. They need to understand these issues. It's up to all of us to help them do that. We should be leaders not only in what we're doing in our state, but our federal policymakers should be leaders on these issues nationally as well. We're not always going to agree with them. And certainly we may not give them the same opinion from time to time when we talk to them. But they should be engaged in these issues because Iowa is so important agriculturally and has an impact water quality wise, not only within the state, but outside the state as well.
And let me say, I'm not running either, but I think, I mean, you have an outstanding delegation from Lynn County here, but there's a couple things you can do, and that is I'm trying to think who's announced on the Republican side. David Young's announced, and who have I left out? Matt Whitaker. You certainly can go to appearances by Matt and David and by Bruce Braley and raise the issues that have been talked about today in a very positive way. You certainly can, and certainly thank your state legislators who voted the right way, or thank them for putting. But since questions about Braley, I mean, I'd go to Whitaker and Young's presentations too and say, what do you think about federal farm policy? Do you agree with conservation compliance? And what do you think about Northey's nutrient reduction strategy? I mean, ask them. I mean, educate them and, give a little statement and ask them that. I think that's fine.
Excellent. We had a two-part question here. I want to follow up more on the second. I think the first part we've already discussed, but we've talked about this being Iowa-centric and looking after each other and working together. So, what would the panelists say about outside land ownership and ag interest in Iowa? Not only as people outside of the state, perhaps regionally or nationally own land and farm operations in Iowa, perhaps out of the country as well. What if we have Chinese or other foreign nationals owning land and agribusinesses in Iowa to produce food products for their own countries? How might that impact water quality and water quantity in the state?
I'm going to jump in on this really quick just to say, first of all, the expert in the room on that is Rick Cruz. He understands Iowa farm ownership. If I recall correctly from a legislative presentation he gave 5 or 6 years ago at a committee I was on, understands the impact of farm ownership on stewardship practices, and that's a big issue. The reason I'm jumping in, though, other than to say nice things about Rick Cruz, is and these are all interesting issues, but don't get diverted from what we're talking about here. We're talking about billions of dollars of flood damage, and on the water quality side, billions of dollars of losses in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? So these are, right, you can say, well, we got to balance this and balance that. Oh, let's have this little esoteric discussion about international farm ownership or whatever the question was. I don't mean to be too blunt, but this is a big deal. This is a big deal. If Cedar Rapids floods again like it did in 2008, we heard from some panelists this morning that the damage would be less, and that's right. So instead of $5 billion, it's going to be $3 billion. A flood tops the walls of Quaker Oats, which is only built to 24 feet because they're waiting on the city to build it up to the size that it needs to be built. Does Quaker Oats rebuild in Cedar Rapids, or do we lose 1,200 jobs? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So we got to get after this thing with some urgency. And, okay, yeah, I'm not sure I really care who owns the farm ground, as long as they're doing it in a way that is holding floodwaters that would otherwise ruin Cedar Rapids or Iowa City or Waterloo or Des Moines or Ames or the farmland on western Iowa that was ruined because the reservoir system wasn't built for 12 inches of rain in May in Montana, right? We got to deal with this, and it's urgent. Thanks.
Others to respond?
This calls to mind something that I worked on 15 years ago. Producing one of our APA reports called Planning and Zoning for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. Believe it or not, I have worked on some of these issues in the past. And at one point, I'm going to say this because I think the issue is less who happens to own the land than the nature of the use of the land, regardless of who happens to be actually owning and operating it. At one point, as I was working on that, I was asked by one of our APA board members from Nebraska to come out and conduct a day-long workshop on corporate hog operations and these big concentrated animal feeding operations. And I was initially reluctant because I was like, I don't know if I can do a whole day's workshop on this. And she persisted by saying, well, we can ask you questions all day on this. And so I ended up doing this. How to come to grips with this request to do this training workshop for planners and planning and zoning officials in Nebraska on this subject. What I quickly discovered after I got out there, and by the way, Nebraska does allow zoning related to agriculture, unlike Iowa, which has this exemption, and it's always been there. I surveyed the audience in this room. I wanted to know who these people were that wanted this workshop. I quickly discovered that I had 4 people from Custer County on a newly minted planning commission that was only 4 months old. Why was it formed? Well, because a CAFO was planning to come into Custer County, and there was a public reaction, and so people got upset, and people do this. You know, you get this threat, and then you respond, right? Classic kind of political situation. I thought, well, we need to step back from this for just a second. I said, you know, when you have a reaction like this, clearly there's something more at stake than just simply being opposed to something. If you're opposed to something, it's because you have something else that you want to protect. What is it you want to protect? And we got into this whole discussion about protecting things like rural values, the aesthetic quality of the community that could be threatened with hog farm smells and all this kind of thing. It got to be a very productive thing, and I was glad that I had been invited before we were through, because we got to these root questions of what kind of a community do you want to be able to preserve in the first place? What vision do you want for this community's future? What are you trying to protect? I think it's that kind of exercise that will get us a lot closer to some of the answers we want, particularly with regard to things like water quality and flood protection. But we had to go through that exercise of letting people first vent the opposition and then raise the question, where is this coming from, and what's underlying it? Interestingly, speaking of people, resistance to regulations, at that time, before the wave of CAFOs made it into Nebraska, despite the longstanding ability of counties to zone for agriculture, only about 1/3 of Nebraska counties had a zoning ordinance on the books. If you went back prior to the 1980s, 70s, back, far enough, probably half of them thought that, the others that didn't have zoning ordinances thought zoning was a commie plot, By the time this whole issue had played out, there are only a handful of counties left in Nebraska that don't have zoning ordinances. A wholesale change in attitude toward land use regulation.
Okay.
I leave it at that.
All right, thanks, Jim. Bill?
I think a thread of the question of the decision makers on the farm is very important to understand. So sometimes we talk about agriculture as if it's one entity,
Exactly.
one decision maker, and something changes. Well, we do have complex decision making. We have big farms, we have small farms. We have folks with farm managers, we have absentee landowners that live in town, we have them that are third generation that live outside the state. And we actually don't allow new foreign land ownership of agricultural land in Iowa, but we have some that was grandfathered in years ago. So the challenge now, as we're looking at this as a very practical level, how do we get change? How do we get change in practices? How do we get change in land uses? That means we have different decision makers out there that all, whether it's a regulatory approach or a voluntary approach, we have to understand what goes into those decisions. There are times, actually, absentee landowners can care as much or more than some of the folks locally operating that land. Now, there are times the reverse of that is true too. So our effort needs to be able to reach out to whoever those decision makers are. It's going to be way more complex than what any of us normally think of. It's not an excuse. It has to be something that we overcome and understand. How do we get in front of those folks? Because some of those folks are hard to get to. I think we could get them to change what the operator does on that farm if we can get to them. So it just kind of demonstrates some of the complexity that's there, some of the challenges. It's certainly no excuse for not making this happen the way it needs to.
Thank you. With that, Secretary Northey, it is 2:45, and I was reminded that I know that you need to move on. And I would like for everybody to thank Secretary Northey for being here with us today. Thanks, Phil. Phil.
Oh, it is? Yeah. Take that. Oh, my brain.
Okay, we still have time for a few more questions. Let's keep them going here. This one is directed to Senator Hogg. We started talking about flood control 4.5 years ago. Why are we still talking? We need action. Your plan could help all the towns along the Cedar River. Let's get a timetable with dates when we can get started, even if it's a small start.
Well, why? First of all, let me address why we're still talking about it. First of all, it's a big project, and we have done a lot of things to try to deal with flood hazards. I mean, you heard a lot about the things. We had buyouts, and we've relocated buildings, and we had a program, a little program called iJobs that became somewhat politically unpopular, but without it, I think the city of Cedar Rapids would still be flat in its back. And we rebuilt buildings, and it wasn't just in Cedar Rapids, it was communities across our state. And you know, if you look around Cedar Rapids at the buildings that have now been flood proofed, like this building, like the central fire station being built, like options of Lynn County, which is now the new Lynn County Community Services Center, like the Gene Oxley Public Service Center, all of those buildings had iJobs money in it, in part to flood protect them. So that's a success. That's why that $5 billion in damage is now down to a Rob Hogg official estimate of $3 billion if the same circumstances happen again. Look, this is a big issue. It requires an infusion of money. I would have, we just voted for $3.8 billion in tax cuts over the next 10 years. Oh, for 1/5 that amount, or 1/6 that amount, or 1/4 that amount, we could have had comprehensive watershed management across the state. It's a question of priorities. And we simply need to get people organized to speak up. This is what the Cedar River Watershed Coalition has been about, trying to create that constant presence that says we need our political and civic leaders to focus on this. And so let's give it a run. We had a little success in the legislative session this year from the clean water side. Let's push people to say, let's put this together. And meanwhile, let's encourage and celebrate those things that have been implemented. Let me give you an example. I don't think people in Cedar Rapids know this, and I didn't know it until I had to do a little research a couple weeks ago. One of the projects funded by iJobs was to build detention basins in Hudson. Why? Because Hudson suffered severe local flood damage. So iJobs, through the Disaster Mitigation Fund, put some money in there. Hudson's got a little degree of safety through those detention basins. Does that help us incrementally down here? Of course it does. But instead of one of those, we need hundreds of them, thousands of them. And we need to continually drive that effort. And that's what people in this room can do. You can talk to, if you're a civic leader, political leader, citizen, you can be engaged in this effort and push. And the one, and I hope this current flood event does not turn out to be as bad as I think it might be in some places. It's dry outside, that's good. But hopefully it will be a reminder that this really is in some sense, a life and death struggle for some communities. I mean, University of Iowa floods again like it did in 2008. After we've spent $1 billion rebuilding it. That hurts the University of Iowa long term, period. Us, if we flood again, how many businesses are going to come back downtown? Right? This is, we were very, very lucky. We heard a great story this morning about how successful our recovery has been, which is great. But if it happens again, last night we had the speaker from Houston over at the Art Museum. Galveston used to be the leading city in that part of Texas. Mm-hmm. Right. After the hurricane in 1900, it wasn't. And after the Hurricane Ike, Galveston's a dying town. Houston's not. The stakes are just incredibly important here, and we need people to be engaged at a sustained civic level. And I think we take a push this year, 2013. We try to get civic leaders, political leaders in this area to put some timetables, some targets on comprehensive watershed management. I think with the flood center now, we're starting to have some of the tools. I'm counting on VTech. You're personally responsible for this, for preventing future flood damage. You know that. So we put some timetables on, some targets. This is what we do for watershed management to say we're going to buy down future flood risk. I think we can do it.
Excellent. There's a question from the floor.
The mayor.
Jimmer, Mayor of Charles City. We've been active locally in a number of areas. I certainly have been attending meetings of this sort in a lot of places. I would like to suggest that, at least in terms of the Cedar Valley, in my experience, that we try to tie these issues with economic survival and economic development language for a reason, which is if you want all the mayors from Mason City to Iowa City to attend a meeting, you better start talking economic development more than just sort of the disaster story, because it doesn't move them as quickly. And the same thing is true about filling the organizational chair from the rural organizations. Talk about rural development as well as these issues that we're talking about, because they come together. Eventually, you've been saying that all along. Monetize the benefits, talk about the various ability to attract industry as opposed to losing it. So that's my suggestion for discussion on the floor.
Yes, anybody want to respond to that? And the focus is, and if you haven't heard the question, is really in flood recovery and flood resiliency to focus more on economic development to make communities strong and whole locally, rather than painting the disaster story yet again. Anybody want to respond? Jim?
One of the poster children we've been using at APA with regard to that, and this does grow out of a disaster, but sometimes disasters do at least focus people's attention, and they cause us to rethink things, and so they become a tool. But, you know, disasters can come in a variety. They don't have to just be natural disasters. It can be, you know, focusing people's attention on the dying business community. You know, Pittsburgh had to deal with the loss of the steel industry. It figured out other ways of reshaping its economic development. But the poster child I'm going to refer to for that's closer to the small town model is Greensburg, Kansas, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it. I've actually had a number of opportunities to work with the mayor out there, Bob Dixon, who is a great model of somebody who is really inspired leadership. But it's also the entire community somehow latched onto this vision as they had to rebuild after that tornado 6 years ago, of rebuilding green, or as they put it, putting the green back in Greensburg. You drive out there now, here was a small town that, you know, had been slowly declining demographically. You look at the census numbers, ever since like about 1930, it's been on this slow, you know, decline, people moving out. How, you know, and as they said, you know, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, how do we expect any different result? Like the Einstein quote. Why not do something bold and dramatically different? So comes the green community. You go out there now, and the first thing you see as you drive down the highway into Greensburg, these big windmills. You see solar panels. There is geothermal development underneath the new school, the combined high school and elementary school that serves the county. And on it goes. Basically, a community that has found a way to become 100% dependent on renewable energy, reinvented itself, and it is slowly, steadily changing the demographics of the community and changing the profile of its economic development opportunities as well. Because although some of the older folks who didn't want to go through the sweat and the turmoil of figuring out how to rebuild have left, there are new younger families that have latched onto this new vision that they find exciting and are moving in. And so suddenly the age profile, the average age of Greensburg is declining, which is a sign of new growth. Before it was heading up into the average age of about 50 or something. Which is a sign of a community's slow demise. We have this idea, I'm still trying to figure out how to make it work in terms of finding funding to move it forward, et cetera, at APA about green post-disaster recovery. Because there are some other examples, you know, Valmeyer, Illinois, after the 1993 floods, both relocated and solarized, moved uphill. Soldiers Grove, going back further. Somehow, I want to find a way to operationalize this concept of green post-disaster recovery to create some hope. And you don't have to have the disaster, but it certainly is a tool to organize and mobilize.
Let me just add a couple points to this question about how you get people motivated. First of all, just because Mayor Erb's come down here and done such a great job, let me put a plug in for his Charles City Whitewater weekend this weekend.
Oh, delayed actually because of high waters. So.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
well, so much for what I know.
Takes
Anyway,
skill
Charles
level.
City. Who here has been to Charles City and seen their whitewater course? And yeah, it's now the last weekend in June. Thank you, Joe. So that's an example though of how you can turn something into an economic advantage. If we had to pay the costs of the disaster ourselves, right? I think it would get people's attention. We got, I don't know, somewhere between, let's just round off, $1.5 billion of federal and state money into Cedar Rapids alone, I'm going to guess. And a bunch of people had insurance, a bunch of people had resources and were able to pay for it. You know, it happens again. Does anybody think the federal and the state governments are going to be there at the same level? No. I mean, it is a matter of economic survival. I would point out, too, you know how much we've had this big debate as a country about the sequester in Congress? You know, it's been awful. It's caused flight delays and it's laid off meat inspectors and it's done, you know, a head start. And the sum total of the savings from that is roughly equivalent to what the federal government had to pay for Hurricane Sandy recovery. So we basically paid for Hurricane Sandy recovery by this awful budgetary thing, right? So the stakes on this are really, really high. And I like the way, Mayor, you phrased it as economic survival. I think it is. You know, when as I've lived and represented Cedar Rapids, the businesses that have been lost were primarily the businesses that were lost because of the flood, right? I think probably the single biggest threat to the survival of a business in Cedar Rapids since I've been in office was the flood. So we need to get people engaged in this. I mean, there's no question. And if it's economics, if it's disaster prevention, whatever moves people, we got to get them engaged, push for it. It doesn't. If we decide to wait 2 more years, it doesn't get easier unless there's another flood. But we've made some progress. We need to build on that progress and really get after it if we want to do what's responsible for safeguarding people and property in the future in Cedar Rapids and across our state.
Great, and I think a couple times we've heard in the panel session is it's about community building, and it's community building to support legislative actions. It's community building by folks like the Iowa Soybean Association. Secretary Northey had talked about there might be some bad actors out there, but if you have other producers that are good actors, it's community building within the agricultural community to say this is the right thing to do. And so as a closing question. And I'd like to start with Roger. How do you work with community building and visioning? Because I know you guys do a great job with watershed planning. You're putting planners out in the watersheds. And how do you work with your constituents to build a vision to the future that is one of balance and sustainability?
Well, it's about applying a fundamentally sound planning process. It's about investing in people. And I'm fortunate to have some planners on staff that are very capable. But when they go to a community, it isn't our plan. It's the local community's plan. And so there has to be some management commitment to that process. So it has to be a legitimate planning process. We also invest in monitoring and surveillance and assessment, and it's just using a good planning framework. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we haven't been real good at planning. And so in some respects, we're learning. And I, whether it's economics, I think businesses, farmers are in the business to make money. It's about economics. It's about jobs. And so I agree, and that has to be considered as part of the planning process. These watershed plans can be about water quality, it can be about hydrology, it can be about economics. And you just fundamentally do a good job of what resources you're concerned about, what assets you have, and you deploy those to exploit those strengths and opportunities, and you address the weaknesses and the threats, right?
Yeah.
And we got to have people out there doing that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Roger. Jim, a quick comment on visioning and community building?
From our perspective, I mean, we spend a lot of time doing training out there, training workshops for planners and trying to build the skills to deal with some of these issues. One thing I want to note, because it relates specifically to the ability to move the ball on this set of issues related to floods, is that I've been at this business about 20 years now, working on disaster-related questions in planning. Back then, it was hard to get 20 or 30 people in a room at our national APA planning conference with 5,000 people typically at the conference. Hard to get 20 or 30 people in a session focused on hazard-related issues. That's changed, partly because we kept pushing the planning profession to get more engaged on this stuff and to get better informed on it and to be better able to lead, and because events pushed it. Katrina was a big one. Sandy has pushed it even farther. It's become clear that this is something that's going to keep happening, and we don't have an escape hatch. We have to deal with it. And the result is that I think we've come a long, long way making big strides in terms of engaging our own members to better inform themselves, to be able to conduct these public participation processes focused on these specific issues. We fill the room now. We did a double session, not one, two in a row, 75-minute sessions on planning for post-disaster recovery that not only had a large audience in the room, but through an agreement to webcast it, drew another 550 people all over the country. So I think we're, that ball is moving forward. We're changing that, and I hope that we can contribute in that fashion to making communities like Cedar Rapids and others more capable of engaging the public in a really informed discussion on these questions.
Great, thanks. Ralph, comment?
Sure. I think that with community building and visioning, we can adopt some of the things that have been talked about today. We talk about database, science-based. We also need to have baselines. We need to have monitoring. We need to have accountability. Whether it's whatever the projects are going to be. And I don't think we want it community by community. I think it's great what Cedar Rapids is doing, and I just want to clone some of your community-based efforts. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily believe in cloning, but that's a different story.
That's a separate topic.
Replication.
Another symposium.
But I think that's the kind of community building. I mean, our council, and you can look at our website, www.iaenvironment.org. You can see how we work with individual communities. There's some threats to Okoboji because of loss of wetlands. There's some threats to Easter Lake. There was some threats through some construction projects. Neither of them per se agriculture. Some people. So I mean, we deal with communities in both the agriculture concerns and then other development concerns. But I think we need to have more of a statewide river-to-river vision. I don't want to wait for each community. I do want Cedar Rapids to go out and praise and be duplicated about this. I appreciate what Roger said. When he talked about planning, because I think that will also help our community building and visioning. When we say wherever we're at, we need to do a better job about the planning and implementation. I agree 100% with Roger on that.
Senator Hogg.
Yeah. First of all, Ralph, don't gush too much over Cedar Rapids. I mean, I appreciate that, and I love Cedar Rapids, but
Okay.
But remember, if that wall of water comes down at us again, we're in deep, deep trouble.
I live 100 miles from there.
I know. If that wall of water goes down through Story County, you're in deep, deep trouble. I mean, we've got a long way
Okay,
to go.
okay.
I mean, so you need to know that. I mean, we've done some things well, but we've got a long way to go. First of all, if I were an expert on this question, we would be in the middle of the third year of a 10-year plan to flood-proof the entire Cedar Valley. So we're not. So maybe I'm not the right person to answer this. And I know we're all busy people, but here are just a few thoughts. First of all, the problem is you got to spend so much time to build the coalition, the political, in a good sense, coalition to do stuff. You've got to spend so much time communicating, not lobbing hand grenades into discussions. That doesn't help. You got to communicate, listen. You've got to sell the need. We have a mutual self-interest in dealing with this. And, when we passed Jeff Pomerantz this morning was gushing about the growth reinvestment initiative and the legislation we passed, or maybe that was the mayor, and we sold the mutual self-interest, right? You lose Cedar Rapids agricultural processing. All of a sudden, farmers don't have, I think that we figured out that was 20 cents a bushel for farmers to have Cedar Rapids here. So you sell the mutual self-interest, but same point with that, that's still not done. So, I mean, you got to sell the mutual self-interest. You got to come out with urgency. Ralph talked about the urgency. It's the spirit of the sandbag. Anybody who would like to go help sandbag, Cedar Rapids has 3 locations operating right now where volunteers can go. And finally, you got to have a little fun doing it. I really think you got to make this thing, it's a lot of hard work. You got to have a little fun, make things enjoyable, which is a good segue into me plugging my book. One more time, the best book ever written on the climate issue. So with that, that's my recommendations, Larry.
Shameless self-promotion. I would like to close by, thanking our speakers once again. This was a tremendous opportunity for me to engage this group of panelists on this very important topic for Iowa. I think one of the take-home messages that we should all have is that it really does come down to individual responsibility and individual involvement. This isn't about Senator Hogg and his colleagues working a half hour longer each day of the session, but it's about having informed citizenry that comes forward to put these issues forward to their local elected officials. And hopefully we can move it forward. And thank you once again.